Hey guys, it's Wes. So I want to finally release the last video in our library management system project that we had started maybe 3 or 4 months ago in .NET Core 1.0. So since then, there have been a lot of projects, and I realized that this was just a loose end that I wanted to wrap up before the end of the year because I know a lot of you guys have been following that tutorial. Sorry for the delay, but thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the final video. Okay, so it's been a little while, but when we had last left off in our library management system project, we had just finished up working on the patron controller and view, where we can actually have an index of the patrons that we have in our system, and then we have a link to each of their profiles here where we can see some information about them, including whether or not this patron has some fees, the library branch they're associated with, and some other properties here. We can also see the assets that they have checked out or are currently on hold. So that's looking okay. And in previous videos, we worked out the actual library catalog system, and we provided the ability to check in or check items out to a particular patron. So in this video, we're going to move ahead and finish the last section of the application, which will be our branches. So if we click view branch index now, which is going to take us to the index action on the branch controller, we just get an empty response here. So we're going to go ahead and create our branch controller now. So I'm going to head into Visual Studio, and I'm just going to go ahead and stop the server if it's running. And now we're going to open up our web project. And inside of our controllers folder here, we're going to go ahead and create our branch controller. And we'll just create an empty MVC controller, and we'll call it branch controller. Okay, so we have this scaffolded out for us as usual a little bit. We've got our branch controller, which extends the controller base class, and we have our index action result here. So let's go ahead and create a constructor for our branch controller, as we've done with our other controllers here. And we're going to leverage dependency injection to inject an instance of our library branch service. And actually, of course, this will be a service that we'll need to go ahead and write now as well. But the way this is going to work is, like our other services, we'll have a private field here. And maybe we'll just call it branch. And then in the constructor, we'll set that field. And so we'll need to create a library branch, iLibrary branch interface that our library branch service will implement, and that we can use in our controller here. So let's head down into our services project. And if you recall, if you've been following this tutorial, we have a checkout service, a library asset service, and a patron service here. So we have a service each for not necessarily an entity model in our system, but in this case, these are entity models, each of these patrons, library assets, and checkouts. In general, I like to associate services with some functional aspect of our application, so they help us work with data in a particular area of our system. So we're going to go ahead and create a new service for our library branches. And I'm just going to call that library branch service. And so we'll go ahead and make this class public, and it's going to implement iLibrary branch, which is an interface that we'll have to also create. And if you recall, we are keeping all of our interfaces for this particular application in our library data project. So if you recall, we have interfaces for the checkout service, the library asset service, the patron service. And so let's go ahead and create a new interface in this project. Called iLibrary branch. And we'll make the interface public. And we'll go ahead and define some methods that we may want to implement in anything that implements this interface, including our library branch service. So the first thing we'll do is create a method that returns an enumerable collection of library branches called getAll. And for this, I'll control period and bring in our models namespace. We can return some other types of collections here if you want. We can return a collection of patrons, which will be a method called getPatrons. Each of the patrons has a home library branch, and so there may be some case when we want to actually see all of the patrons whose home library branch is some particular branch corresponding to a branch ID. And maybe we would also like to return a collection of library assets for a particular branch. We could just return a library branch with a method get, perhaps. We could create a void method to add a new library branch, and to that we'll actually pass a new library branch object. And perhaps there are a few more methods that we might want to define. For instance, say we wanted to get the branch hours, which we're just storing as a collection of strings in this case. I'm just going to move that one up here with the other collections. And maybe we'll have a single bool method here, a method that returns a bool to determine whether or not a branch is open. Okay, so pretty simple interface, just a few methods here that we can implement in our branch service. So let's head back into our library branch service. We can now actually implement this interface. So we'll bring in the library data namespace, and if we control period again, we can very quickly implement this interface. So I'm going to go ahead and remove an unused using here and just collapse the usings for the time being. Now, the first thing that we should do here is provide our service with a library context so that it can actually interact with our data. So you'll be familiar with this if you've followed along and seen the other services that we've built here. It's going to be very similar. So we've got our library context we'll store in a private field, and then in a constructor for library branch service, we can actually just assign the private field to the library context that we're using. Okay, so let's work through these methods pretty quickly. Add, again, should look very similar to the other add methods that we have in services in this project. So we've got, we can just use our context and simply add the new branch and then save changes. So of course this method will take a new library branch object that we can build, and then Entity Framework will take care of adding it by identifying its type. And so when we save changes, we actually commit that insert against our database. So our get method is basically just going to return from our context library branches. And now let's go ahead and make sure that on library branches we also include all of the patrons and library assets. So to use include, we need to bring in Entity Framework Core. And so we'll bring in the branches patrons, and we'll also include the branches library assets. Oops, okay. And then we'll just call first or default. To use this, we'll need to bring in system.link. And basically we want to find the first or default library branch where the branch ID is equal to the branch ID that we pass our service method here. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean up this method so that we can read it a little bit more easily. So include will essentially include these linked objects that are on our library branch object when we construct this query and the results get returned. So when we get a particular library branch by its ID, we'll also have the patrons and library assets associated with that branch when the results get returned from our link query. And of course, we're just calling first or default to get the first or default library branch whose ID corresponds with the ID that we pass get. Okay, so far so good. Let's go ahead and write our getAll method. This is also a one-liner here. We can just return from our library branches, and in fact we can actually just include the patrons and library assets as well. So I'm just going to copy that from the method above, and we could refactor this. Now you can see we could simply here just return getAll, and then calling first to default on that. Okay, so now let's say that we want to get the library branches assets. So here we can return from our context library branches. We can include those assets. For a particular branch ID. So you can see just very quickly we can start refactoring some of these methods. So where the branch ID is equal to the ID that we pass the getAssets method, and then just call .libraryAssets on it to return those objects. Now of course here this is actually equivalent, well nearly equivalent to simply calling get and then grabbing the library assets. I won't refactor it here directly because there is a slight difference here in that getAssets here actually just explicitly includes only library assets in the query, and our get method includes both library assets and patrons. So we'll just leave this method constructed as it is here, and now we can address getBranchHours. So we want to return a collection of strings when we call getBranchHours for a particular branch ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to store the hours in a var and just do a very simple query here against our BranchHours DB set, and we can simply say where the set of hours .branch .id is equal to this branch ID. And the reason I'm storing this in a var is because I'd like to go ahead and return these in a particular, a more human readable display rather than just a collection of long datetime strings. So what I'm going to do is create a method to, in a sense, humanize the business hours so that they're a little bit more readable. And the way that I'm going to do that is in our services project, I'm just going to create a new class. And we're going to just call it data helpers. We'll make it public, and I like to have a separate class like this that will contain methods or potentially contain methods that might be useful across our service classes here. So we could make some private method that humanizes business hours in our library branch service and just put it towards the bottom of this file or something. But I think it's better practice to keep the services as light as possible and just essentially have them contain only public methods, if possible, for simply returning the results from some query to our database, and any other type of methods that are basically for helping us construct that data in some way we'll place into a separate class. And if the project was big enough, we might even put that in its own class library that we could reference anywhere else in our application that we like. In this case, we'll just have some data helpers that help us in our library services project. So I'm going to create a public method, and we'll make it static. It'll return an enumerable of strings, and we'll just call it humanize business hours. And itself is going to take a collection of branch hour objects. Oops. And for this, of course, we'll bring in our data namespace, and just to shorten the method name a little bit here, I'm going to rename this humanize biz hours. So let's go ahead and write a simple version of this method. Let's have a var hours, which will just be a list of strings. This will be essentially what we want to return ultimately. But we want to build it up into a list of human readable strings. And so we've got this collection of branch hours objects, and if we just take a quick look to remind ourselves what's in here, we've got these ints that represent a day of week, an open time, and a close time. And we have a reference to the particular library branch that these hours corresponds. And we've got some attributes here that help us define the particular range, the valid range for each of these properties. So this is a little bit of an interesting way to set up branch hours. If I were going back and doing it again, I might set these up as, say, time spans, but this will work, and let's just go ahead and get it working with our service. So what I'm going to do is we have this new empty list of strings, and we have the branch hours that we are going to pass this method humanize business hours. So I'm just going to loop over each of the branch hours that are in that collection. So we can say for each var time in branch hours, we're going to have a var day, and we'll write a method to humanize the day of the week. So the method will just be called humanize day, and basically we'll take the day of the week. We'll have a var open time. Here we'll actually write a method to humanize the time. And we'll reuse that to humanize the close time as well. And then I'm essentially going to use each of these three variables to construct a little time entry that we can put into our list. And so I'm just going to use some string interpolation here to basically put in a string that says day, open time, to close time. Okay, and once that's constructed, then we can add that string to our hours list. And I suppose it's okay here if we just return a static list in this case anyway. Okay, so pretty simplistic. Now let's go ahead and write these two methods so that we can use our humanize biz hours method. I'll make these methods public as well. Humanize day first, which will take the integer day of the week. And here we can return the name of the day of the week using the enum class getName, and then we'll just say type of day of week, and then the number that we pass humanize day. So kind of a quick one-liner there to help us actually return the name of the day of the week that corresponds to the particular number that we have here. And we don't have to write any more custom code for that. So it's pretty cool, and we can do something else here to actually humanize the time. So here we're just simply going to return, using Timespan, we can call .from hours, passing it the time. This is going to return a timespan, and then simply call toString, and use a little bit of string formatting here to just get the hours and the minutes extracted from that particular time span. Oops, and yeah, just fix a quick typo here. Okay, cool. So we're going to pass it some hours, and given the hours that we pass it here, that's going to convert it to a time span that we can then display in terms of hours and minutes in the day. Okay, so some pretty simplistic helper methods here. I'm just going to go ahead and clean up an unused using here, and we'll head back into our library branch service. So now, when we want to get the branch hours, we are basically writing a query to get the branch hours by a particular branch ID. And then we can return some display type hours, if you will, by using our data helpers and using the humanize biz hours method, passing it the hours from our query here. Okay, not so bad. If we want to get our patrons, again, this should be pretty simple. We can just return context.library_branches. We'll include only the patrons. And we'll call first or default, where the branch ID is equal to branch ID that we pass this method. And then just grab the patrons property off of it here. And that's going to return a collection of those patrons that are associated with our library branch. Okay, and one more method. This one again is pretty simple. We just want to know if a branch is open given its ID. So first of all, we need to know the current time, which we can just grab with datetime.now. And we'll also want to know the branch hours, which we can actually just copy from our getBranchHours method here. And given the simplistic way that we basically constructed our branch hours, once again, if we go back and take a look at our branch hours entity model, we can see that we basically just have an open time, which is an integer hour value, and a close time integer hour value. Let's just get the integer hour value pulled out of our current time, and then return true if it's between the open and closed time value, otherwise we'll return false. So instead of just pulling the current time out, we'll pull out current time hour. And I suppose the other thing that we need to check is the actual day of the week as well. So we'll say var current day of week, which we can say is datetime.now.day of week. And what I'm going to do is make this actually return an integer. And so 0 should correspond to Sunday, but the way that we actually have our data set up, if we take a look at our branch hours, we have days of week 1 through 7 instead of 0 through 6. So what I'm going to do is make the current day of the week the value datetime.now.day of week plus 1. And that's a little hacky, but that's just the way that the data was that we set up here in terms of our days of the week. And so we can either adjust for it in the data here by decrementing every day of the week here by 1, or we can simply add 1 in the code here. So let's assume that we can't change our data for some reason, and so if we need to change it in code, this would be a way that we could perhaps work with it. Okay, and now to get to the particular hours for the day for this particular branch, we have this collection of hours getting returned to us here. And so what we can say is like the day's hours are hours dot first or default, where the day of the week is equal to the current day of the week. So in a sense, we're looking at a single row now in our data. So now we just want to verify that the current time is between the row's open time and the close time. So we can simply have a var is open, and we'll set that to just check a conditional here. So the current time hour is less than the day's hours dot close time, and current time hour is greater than the day's hours open. And we can simply return is open here. And in fact, we could just return this. So we just want to check that the current time that it is now is less than the day's hours close time, which is an integer, and greater than the day's hours open time, which is an integer. So it's a pretty simplistic check, but we have a pretty simplistic way to represent branch hours as well. So given that we have this sort of structure where we have integers actually representing hours, then this may be a way that we can actually check whether or not a branch is open. Alright, so that wraps up our library branch service. Now we can actually use any of these methods that we need in our library branch controller. So I'm going to go ahead and close out a bunch of these open windows that we have. and we'll go back into our branch controller. So now we should be able to control period and bring in our library data namespace and get to work here writing our index action. So I'm also going to minimize our library data service project and the library data project. And let's open up our view models in our web project. So here we'll go ahead and create a new folder called branch. And I haven't been totally consistent in naming here. I can see that I named the checkout models folder checkout models, but the other three now just don't have models as a suffix. That's all right. So we're going to go ahead and add a new class here for our branch index model. And this is going to be a very lightweight model, which will contain a collection of detail models. So an IEnumerable of branch detail model types. And we'll just call those branches. So we need to bring in the generic collections namespace, and now we need to go ahead and create our branch detail view model here. So I'm going to go ahead and create that here. Add a new class. This should be another view model POCO class called branch detail model. Okay, so this is the model that will have all the interesting stuff on it, if you will. So it's going to have an ID for the particular branch. It's going to have an address. It's going to have a branch name, an open date, so that will correspond to like when the branch was actually opened. And I'll keep this as a string, but that could also be a date time, of course. We'll have a telephone number. We'll have a bool to represent whether or not it is open. We could perhaps have a description for the branch that we might want to put on our page. And a few other things here. We could, for instance, have a property for the number of patrons. Maybe the number of assets. We could have a decimal. Since our assets have a certain value associated with them, we could have total asset value. That will give us a sense of, what branches have perhaps a lot of values in terms of library assets and which have less. And we'll have a string for an image URL for the branch. And then finally we'll have a collection of strings for the hours that the branch is open. Okay, so pretty simple view model there. So let's make use of it in our controller. So when we hit our index action, what I want to do is let's create a var branches. And we're going to use our branch service here to get all of our library branches. And what we're going to do is from that collection that gets returned from our link query, we're going to simply select that into a new branch detail model object. Okay, so we just need to actually go ahead and use system.link here. And we'll use library.models.branch as well. Okay, so now we can just set the properties. So pretty straightforward. So we've got the name, whether or not it's open we can set, and for that we can use our service again, and we'll say is branch open. The number of assets, let's go ahead and store that in the number of assets. So we can just call .count. Number of patrons, we can do something very similar. So we'll use our branch service again, get patrons, branch.id.count, Now these queries aren't necessarily optimized. If we had lots of patrons in our system and a large number of assets, a large number of library branches, then we may consider, and certainly would consider, coming back and refactoring some of the queries here. For instance, when we're calling get patrons in our branch service here, if we recall, come back here, and we'll scroll down to get patrons, we're actually including the entire patron object just to then turn around and simply get a count. So that's a little inefficient. We don't need to know everything about the patron. We don't need to collect all of that data just to get a count for the total number of patrons. So in fact, we might write a separate query just to increase the efficiency of that a little bit. But for our purposes, calling count on the get patrons method, what it returns, that should also work. Okay, let's stick with this for now, and we'll create a view model to return to the index here. So this will be a branch index model. And we just have the one property to set, which is the branches. And now we can return that model to our view. Alright, so we're going to actually create the view here in just a moment, but similar to when we created our patron index and we had the ability to create a detailed page for each of the patrons, we'll have something analogous here for our library branches. So what I'm going to do, since it is relatively simple to do, is stay with the controller here for a moment and just go ahead and write the detail action result for this as well. We'll have a detail action result that will take the branch ID, and we'll store that branch in a var here. We can use our branch service just to get the branch by ID, and then we'll just select the data that we need into a new branch detail model here, since we have a reference to that entity model in our branch var. So say our model is a new branch detail model with the name and all the other properties. So to save some time here, I'm just going to go ahead and paste those in. Okay, so on the detail page, we'll have all these properties now available. We've got the open date, the number of assets, the number of patrons, which again we'll just call .count here. The total assets value, this we'll get by calling get assets again, passing it the ID, and then just getting a sum of all of the assets cost. And in fact here I can also do a little bit more cleaning up. Okay, so pretty simple stuff. Let's go ahead and write our view now. So we're gonna just minimize the models folder and the controllers folder, and then in views, let's head over into our views folder in the library project. Now I'm gonna create a new folder as usual here, which we'll just call branches or branch, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new view, but I'm just going to do that through the new item and be an MVC view page index.cshtml. So go ahead and add this now. So we'll get rid of the scaffolded out code that we have here, and at the top we'll specify our model. So we have our branch index model this time, and we can use the view bag title of branch index here. Okay, so at the top of the page, we'll just keep this really simple. We'll just have the viewbag.title here. Okay, and then I'm just going to have a div with an ID of branch index here. And we're just going to have a very simple table that we'll use to put some of the properties out to the page here. So again, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And if you're interested in copying the code exactly here, I'll have it available here in the video, of course, so you can pause, or also this will be available on the project's GitHub page as well. But you can see what's happening here. It is quite a bit like the other index views that we have for patrons, for example, or library assets. We basically just have a table that's got a header for each of the property names that we want to display on the index. And then for each of the branch detail objects that are in our branches collection on the index view model, we can simply put a new row out to the page here in our table. And so we'll have whether or not the branch is open, the total number of assets, and the patrons. And we'll also have a link over to the detail view for that particular branch, and the route ID for that will of course just be the branch's primary key. Okay, so that should wrap up our very simple index view. I want to head back into the branch controller, and it looks like we need to still return the detail view model, so we can return that to our view and just pass it here. Okay, and the other thing we need to do also is remember to register the new service that we created in our startup class. So I'm going to scroll down here. You can see where we're configuring services. We're adding scoped services anytime we're asking for a particular implementation of them here. So we can just go ahead and also add services.addScoped for our iLibrary branch. So we'll implement that using our library branch service, which has the implementation of all those methods that are defined in that interface. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and start the server and make sure that everything is compiling. Okay, so it's looking good so far. Now if we click on branches, you can see that we have our branch index here with an item for each of the branches in our database. And we can see whether or not it's open now is true or false here. So if we click on one of these, we're currently going to get an error because we don't have a detail view created yet, so we can go ahead and create that now. Okay, so I'm just going to stop here and this server will shut down. And now in views, we'll go ahead and create our detail view in the branch folder. Okay, so once again, we'll go ahead and delete things that we don't need. Set the model to be the library.models.branch detail model. Oops, and library. Okay, so now we can also, if we like, set this view bag. And what we'll do is we'll set it equal to the branch name plus space branch. And sorry, yeah, just model.name here. Okay, so I'm going to have a container div. And the first thing that I'm going to have in our container is a heading. It says branch information. And then I'm just going to go ahead and make a Jumbotron. We'll tuck a row in here. And what we'll do is we'll place the image for the particular branch using an image tag here, and we have access to the image URL on the branch detail model. Then we'll have a div class row, branch info, and this will be where we have more of the information about our branch. So I'm going to divide this row up into two columns. So we'll have a call medium 8. We'll have some stuff in there, and then we'll have a separate column here, call medium 4, where we'll have some more information. So in the first column, I'm going to put some info about the branch's contact and the description. So I'm just going to paste that in here. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and fix up some of this, and then we'll talk about what all is in here. So this again is branch model.name. So we've got our column medium 8 here. It's going to have the branch name. It's going to have a div of class branch contact. That's got the address and telephone number for the branch. Then we'll have a div that contains the branch description. And then we have a little section here where we loop over the hours for that branch, and then we put that out in an unordered list here. And so if you recall, this will actually be grabbing those humanized, more readable hours that we constructed. Okay, so then on the right side here, I'm actually gonna paste the remainder of this template, which will actually just be a table. So let's take a look at that. So we're gonna have a table here, and the table will contain information such as when the branch was opened. So I need to fix that. And then some of that other aggregate data that we have, so the number of patrons, assets, and the total asset value. So we should have, there's a pretty basic page that contains some information about the particular branch that we're viewing. So let's go ahead and start the server and see how it looks. Okay, so we can click on View Branch Index again, and let's just click on Lakeshore Branch. So that's looking pretty good. It looks like we're not getting the image for the branch out to the view, and we also have a little bug here where it looks like the start day is Monday and then it goes through Saturday, and then we don't have the day of the week here. So I suspect that has something to do with the way that I kind of slung in the code for the humanized date. So we can take a look at that, and we can also take a look if we're just missing an asset for the branch's image here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is check in the database for the URL to this branch's image. We only have a couple branches, 3 branches in here. So I'm just going to select star, and we can see that, yeah, each of the branches should have an image URL in this relative location in the images folder /branches/1, 2, and 3. So what I'm going to do is open up the File Explorer and go to that location in our project. So if we take a look here, it looks like in the images directory relative to the www root directory in our project, I'm specifying images/branches/1, 2, and 3, when in fact the folder is named libraries. So if I just change this to branches, then we take a look here, I do have images 1, 2, and 3.png, and so now we should just be able to refresh the page, and indeed we can see the image. So that part's fixed. We can verify that it's working for the other libraries as well, so that looks pretty good. And now what I'd like to do is go ahead and see if we can fix and figure out what's happening here with this bug where we are putting the dates out to the page. So what I'm going to do is we'll leave the server running, and we're just going to set a breakpoint in our branch controller. In fact, maybe we should set this in our library branch service, since I suspect it's happening when we are calling this getBranchHours method. So we'll come over here to humanize biz hours in our helper method. So this is in our data helpers class, and then I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint here. And if we just go back and refresh the page, we should hit our breakpoint. So we have this collection of branch hours. Let's see if that's getting passed correctly. I suspect that it is. So we have 7 records for the 7 days of the week. And again, we're starting at the day of the week 1 here. So what's going to happen if we F10 here, and then I'll F10 pass the new list of strings, and then for each time in branch hours, so we're going to come in here, and then if I F11 on humanized day of the week, we're going to pass number 1 here first of all, and so we'll just F10 past this method, and back here we now see that the day gets set to Monday. So in fact we want 1 to correspond with Sunday. And so what's happening is this is going to get all the way to the number 7, for which the day of the week is not defined because the index should start at 0. And our data is structured such that Sunday starts with 1 for us, when C# it would, should interpret that as Monday. So let's go ahead and just fix that up. What we need to have happen here is that we can simply subtract 1 from the number here. So what I'm going to do is just stop the server, and we'll subtract 1. And since it's a little unclear as to why we're subtracting 1, this is a good case for adding a comment to our code, I think. So we'll say our data correlates 1 to Sunday, so we'll subtract 1. Okay, so now if we start the server again, let's take a look and see if this fixes our issue. Okay, so we hit our breakpoint again, and I'm going to set a breakpoint here where we get the first day, and I'm just going to hit F5 to go straight there, and then F10 to step over it, And so now indeed we're getting Sunday for our first day. So I'm going to remove the breakpoints and we'll just hit F5 to continue executing code. And if we scroll down, we should now see Sunday through Saturday here, as we would expect. Okay, so with that, we have more or less wrapped up all the various features for our library management system. If you've been following along, I apologize that this video was so late in the making. I think the last time we worked on this project was maybe 3 months ago, but a lot of you have been asking for it, so I hope that this video was helpful. There's definitely a lot more we could do with this application to improve its usability, scale it, and perhaps even implement it for an actual library management system. There are some things that we may consider doing. So for example, we would probably want an authentication system. We could do some work on our library catalog, certainly by implementing a search feature and some pagination here, and just in general cleaning up the look of the application, certainly. But in general, this should be a decent starting point for an application that will work for checking assets in or out of some system and having those tracked in a database. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Be sure to check out my other videos, particularly those using .NET Core 2.0 and above. This app was of course built using .NET Core 1.0. And if you're interested in a deep dive into actually deploying a .NET Core 2.0 app to Microsoft Azure, then be sure to check out my premium course over at Productive Dev. Be sure to leave questions or comments below, and thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.